Hello, everybody, and welcome. We have quite a few participants registered tonight. I see you entering our little waiting room. Welcome to our Composers Showcase tonight with the Asheville Symphony at Home. My name is Darko Butorac. I'm the music director and conductor of the Asheville Symphony, and it's great. Goodness, so many people already on board, over 40 people currently on this chat. I'm so happy to welcome everybody back. It's going to be a wonderful evening. We have our musicians from the orchestra who are composers. So we're going to be exploring what it's like to compose, what is the process like, questions of inspiration. So a couple of housekeeping things before we delve into things. You can see us, we cannot see you, we cannot hear you. So if you look on your Zoom interface, if you move the mouse or touch the finger in case you're on the phone, there should be a chat box and a Q&A box. And as we go along, because it is quite a different type of panel than we've typically had, not so much focused on performance, I encourage you to feel free to ask questions that you might be curious about as the conversation develops, and we'll try to get to all of them this evening. So again, welcome everybody. It's really a pleasure to be back, and we'll get started. So I'm going to go around our little virtual room and have our guests introduce themselves. So ladies first, I'll invite Isabel to tell us a little bit about herself.
Hi, I'm Isabel Castelvi, and I am a cellist, primarily also a guitarist and singer-songwriter and composer. And I have a background in classical music, like all of us here, but also studied contemporary classical and experimental music and studied music in India, and then also some songwriting. And sort of from my earliest days, loved improvising, and so that's always carried on as an improviser. And mixing all these worlds together is exciting for me, and I'm still learning how to do that. But yeah, I've been in Asheville for 4 years, and it's been wonderful to be a part of the symphony community, and I'm excited to hear where everyone else is coming from.
Tell us a little bit. I'm curious. Where did you study both contemporary, mentioned contemporary composition, and then also your studies in India? Give us just a little more
Yeah,
background on
I did a master's degree at Manhattan School of Music in contemporary performance,
that. Uh-huh.
and it was the second year of a program that's now been running for about 12 years, I think, or 13 years when they first opened up. And it was, I think, maybe one of the first of its kind in the States where we did, you know, our music history was current events and in experimental music. So we really focused mostly from 1960 to the present.
Okay.
And we're working a lot like in the ensemble with composers. And then while I was at Manhattan School of Music, since I wasn't in the classical program at all, the like regular classical program, we mostly just interfaced with the jazz and other music teachers there. And there was an Indian music teacher there who I did my kind of like senior, like master's thesis with, and worked with him one-on-one as a mentor. And through him, I met what became, now my teacher for like 10 years, who I went to India a couple times to study with.
Wow.
And I studied North Indian raga through voice, and then there was a big community for it in New York, so that was like something that like has been intermingled. And several years in, I realized that that is a whole other lifetime of work that I probably can't also digest in this one. So I've allowed it to be a thread without, completely shifting paths and still infused with that. But in New York, I was able to play with a lot of like Middle Eastern ensembles and African musicians, and that all really interwove with what inspires me today, coming from these backgrounds. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned there's not enough lifetimes to study it, and it's true. The music, especially of Indian tradition, that as you mentioned, it's not just one. It's not like India has one tradition. There's regional traditions which are very specific. Instruments are different, and the system of approaching music is completely different than Western music, and fascinating and incredibly virtuosic. And I don't know, I love listening to it. I don't know much about it from a technical perspective. I'm sure Matthew probably has some experience as a percussionist on that element. So actually,
Yeah.
Matthew, give us a little bit of background. You're our acting percussion principal.
Yes.
In this hiatus season, but
Right.
we'll be back. We'll be back.
Yeah. I was definitely the best percussionist this fall, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been the percussionist with the symphony since I think I started in 1999, I believe. And I'm the interim principal percussionist until we're able to do auditions when things get back to normal. I teach music at UNC Asheville, and I'm one of those people who kind of has always wanted to do everything, a jack of all trades. So I started off playing rock and pop music, playing as a drum set player, and did a lot of classical education, but also I play a lot of jazz. I studied Brazilian music and African music and a little bit of Indian music, not a whole lot, a little bit. I really love musical theater. I play a lot of theater shows around the area, and have written a little bit of theater music. And a lot like Isabel, my passion is just breaking down those walls that people think are up there between different types of music and combining them and seeing what you can come up with that's new.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of popular music, I know Franklin has certainly delved a lot in that, and you've been a panelist before, but there's a lot of new people this evening. Just give us a little bit about a background and specifically with your angle towards composition, Franklin.
Yeah, so I'm Franklin Keel. I'm also a cellist, and I'm a former student of Ron Clearfield. He taught me a lot about what I'm doing right now, which is, aside from the symphony, I play in several bands. One of them is in the group Sirius B, which we've dropped the term gypsy, but we're absurdist folk funk punk, and we're looking for an appropriate name to sort of fill in that descriptor. I'm a songwriter and a backing vocalist and cellist in that group. And I also started a group called Upland Drive, where I basically sing, write the songs, and play cello in that group as well. And play in just a lot of different kind of settings, depending on what's needed. I do, composition for, classical ensembles just as a recreation. I've never published a classical piece, but I've done a lot. I've published a few songs through Sirius B and through Upland Drive. My last classical composition was a set of cadenzas for the Haydn Concerti that I did during the COVID pandemic.
Wow, beautiful.
Yeah, thanks.
Beautiful. Great. And Franklin, we should mention to our audience, you have a really cool project coming up this weekend. This is not composition related, this is cello related, but
oh yeah,
tell everyone about that, because I think it's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, I'm playing the complete works by Ludwig van Beethoven for cello and piano this coming weekend. The concerts are Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday. And so the Thursday night concert will be the first two Beethoven sonatas. The Saturday concert will be the third sonata and the Mozart variations. And then the Sunday afternoon concert will be the Handel variations and the fourth and fifth sonatas. And I'm going to put a link in the chat right now so that you can go and visit. That's going to be through the White Horse in Black Mountain. It's where you can find tickets or a lot.
Is that where the performance is?
Huh?
Will the performance be in Black Mountain or?
Yes, the performance will be at the White Horse in Black Mountain, and it'll be live streamed from there as well.
And so in-person attendance is possible?
Yes, in-person attendance is possible. The capacity there is, I think, 21.
So it's indoor situation?
Yes.
So
everybody's got to be masked. and there's probably, again, no more than like 20 people can attend.
Okay.
So it'll be a small audience.
But if you're not able to go or you don't feel comfortable being in an indoor environment, please check out the live stream, because it's wonderful to have live performance of really serious repertoire just anywhere is rare these days. And thank you for doing that for our community. That's really great. So we have the link in the chat box there, whitehorseblackmountain.com. Feel free to click and check it out and see Franklin's music making this weekend. So again, Thursday night, Saturday night, and Sunday afternoon. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Thursday night, Saturday night. Wonderful. Well, speaking of cellists, our last panelist this evening is Ron Clearfield. Ron, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and specifically with angle towards composition.
Thank you, Maestro. It's great to be here tonight. My name is Ron Clearfield, and I was the former assistant principal cellist with the Asheville Symphony. I did that for about 10 years. And I also am the founder, and I was conductor for 12 years with the Blue Ridge Orchestra, which is Asheville's community orchestra. I was very proud of starting that orchestra, and Franklin performed with it many times. And also, for 22 years, I conducted the Asheville Youth Orchestra. And I'm a composer and a recording artist. And I live out here in the mountains with my wife and the horses and the dogs and the cats, and just enjoying life and still composing. I was able to, during COVID, once COVID started, I said, well, I've got to do this project that I've put off for a long time. And here it is, these 5 pieces, I don't know if you can see this, for cello and piano. And worked out fine. I self-published it, and very happy with it. So that's what I've been up to.
I love it. Let's begin. I'm going to go straight into the meat of the matter, because for me, I'm a performing musician. I used to be a cellist in one past lifetime, it seems like. I'm a conductor now, waiting for an orchestra to come back and be able to perform. But, the process when you are performing is you have the piece of music in front of you, you open it up, you dissect it, you can spend an entire lifetime studying it, but there is immediately, by definition, there is something concrete you're dealing with, something concrete you're approaching with. Ron, I'll start with you because we ended with you. How do you approach composition when there is a giant blank slate? How is that first step taken?
Usually just by improvising. In fact, these 5 pieces I had recorded years ago, and basically they were developed out of improvisations. And I know a lot of composers work that way. I mean, not comparing myself, but the great Beethoven always wrote basically out of improvisations, and other people, composers, whatever, they have it kind of figured out, like somebody like Mozart in their head. But I basically always worked out of improvisation.
Are you starting on the cello when you're improvising, or?
Well, depending on what I mean, I also have a collection of 4 unaccompanied cello pieces that basically completely was just, I wrote a piece called Cello Raga, where I detuned the top 2 strings, the A and the D, so you have a C, C, G, G, C, G, C, G. And,
so a lot of drone, a lot of same pitches.
Yeah, bring down the A to the G and the D to the C, and it totally opens up the cello. It's a great sound. Try it sometime. And just used to just do ragas and do different modal things. And it was out of improvisations that I finalized this piece called Cello Raga. So I'm basically the kind of person that just improvises, whether it's on the piano or the cello. And then when I finally had to sit down, and I'd been putting it off for years to actually finalize this music, it was really hard, because I had sketches and stuff like that, and I had the recordings, but I didn't know always what exactly I was playing. I knew what I was playing because I did it, but what it looked like on paper. So it was quite a challenge. And get back to the writing software, and but I'm happy how it came out. Yeah,
that's a interesting point I'd love to get back to, which is you're describing the challenge of having something in your hand and in your fingers, and how to actually translate that both in spirit and in actual execution on paper. And oftentimes, as performing musicians, we have to remind ourselves that sometimes what is on the paper is an intention of gesture or style that cannot be quite expressed on paper. And in fact, the humanity of music making lies in that in those little imperfections. Now, the cliche thing is, if you look at like different types of like when jazz bands swing, it's never notated how it sounds. It simply must be felt together as an ensemble. Same thing happens when you play Viennese waltzes. That's the cliche example with orchestras. The simple thing like chuck 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 is never that to get it to really move. And I love that. I love that it works both ways. The challenge exists both ways. I'll go back to Isabel. Same question. What's your first step when you're writing a new piece? I didn't ask this of Ron either, but do you ever set limits and say, okay, I'm going to work within these parameters? Because right now it seems, once John Cage says 4 minutes and 33 seconds, anything is music. There's literally no restrictions. Do you ever impose your own restrictions on a piece you're doing to be able to be creative within a framework, let's say?
Yeah, I will speak to, I'm very similar as Ron. I mostly compose from improvisation, and either with cello, guitar, or singing, or a combination of those things. And oftentimes when I've written multi-part music for chamber ensembles, I will have like recorded many layers of myself, and then I have to go through that painstaking process of like, how do I get this on paper for other people to read? And that usually takes longer than the creative process for me as well.
When you're layering, are you starting with bass lines first? Are you starting with the harmony, or are you starting with the melody? Or just depends on the inspiration?
It depends. Yeah, it totally
Okay.
depends. Sometimes it's unknown to me, but I'm just excited to follow what will come out. And then from there, I can kind of like make more intentional decisions after I let that process be more free. And as far as limitations, I've written a lot for dance. I've worked with like several choreographers, both before I moved to Asheville and then a little bit here. And so that's always an interesting limitation, and I've been commissioned in that way a couple of times.
Are they
And
limited in terms of, are we talking about things like meter, pulse, pace, a bit of everything? How does
well,
the
yeah.
dance commission start? What did it tell you? I want a piece in 3/4 time?
No, but I had this one woman who commissioned me once, and she had created this beautiful dance, and she had already commissioned someone, and she decided she didn't like the score. So somebody sent her to me from like a off-Broadway gig in New York, and then we worked on something, and we had this great meeting, and she described this idea, and I described where I came from, and we're like, great, this is great. And I was like, I'm going to Europe to tour for like 2 months. I'll meet you when I come back. And we left with this intention. And so while I was touring in Europe, I was like writing music in the car. And this was like, I was really having to compose more in my mind. And I came back, and I think I was supposed to have rehearsal the next day, but I was too jet lagged. So I pushed it a couple days. And then like we had rehearsal, and she was like, oh, that's like not at all what I was expecting. And I was like, oh, well, I told you I write like modern contemporary music. And she was like, I meant like, and then she sent me all these examples, and it was very different. So we had this interesting process of trying to meet worlds of where I couldn't quite make a voice sound like something I wouldn't write, but like move closer to. And it was originally commissioned for cello and violin, and then she insisted on having French horn weaved in. So it was this interesting process, and it created its own limitations. It was a very difficult thing to blend.
Like cello violin is a good combo. French horn is like
No.
bringing a tank to like a bicycle party.
It was very bizarre, but I ended up, having to, that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to write, was how to write for these three, because exposed by itself, it's very odd combo.
Yeah.
And we performed, at Jacob's Pillow in the Berkshires in the summer, hot, so our instruments did the opposite thing in tuning. Then we performed at Alvin Ailey, too much AC, opposite tuning again. So it was very interesting around limitations, but I learned a lot from that process of refine and like just like pushing myself to explore new possibilities and another instrument. And so that was cool. But in my own creative space, I generally just play, and I often do compose for very specific situations. So like I used to play in a string quartet in New York, and I wrote music for us, or different chamber ensembles, and or like here in the Asheville Percussion Festival a few years ago, like when it was the women's year, and I wrote a piece for that. And it's most direct for me in an ensemble time when I'm usually working directly with musicians. And this spring and summer worked with an experimental like performance art music group that I am a part of, that's still New York based. And we've composed two new, like kind of, I would say, almost more experimental theater pieces for Zoom. And mostly we had to go that other extreme because music is so hard to do. But we found ways to work with sound in this medium and really like embrace the limitations of Zoom to find out how to create music together and sound. And so that was also very interesting because I wanted to write this piece. We were singing long notes, and Zoom, after initial attack, makes the sound go down. So
Right.
we learned that if we sang like na 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 na, it created this illusion of a sustained thing, but it would Zoom would keep attacking the sound, so it would allow it to sustain. So it was interesting things like that are limitations, but they're usually circumstantial for me.
Yeah. I love the New York Phil had a bunch of different kind of short master classes as part of their quarantine, social media presence. One of them, I want to say it was Eric Whitaker, who gave the challenge to composers: write a piece using just 4 notes. Choose 4 notes and see what you can do with it. It really reduces your pitch material by an entire third. And I didn't try it yet, but I still want to. I'm not far from a composer. I'm just curious in the exercise because really, if you limit parameters as a composer, you're able to expand maybe different ones. It's almost like limiting your senses. If you close your eyes, maybe you hear a little better, this kind of thing. And so oftentimes, a piece can be fascinating just with minimal material. And I think it was kind of a great challenge. Anyway, that's a digression. Matthew, I'll go to you. Have you worked with dancers before in your compositions? Has that been a part of your background?
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of that. I've done several collaborations with the Asheville Ballet, particularly. Written some things for them, both in a classical style and with a pop band. And it's fascinating. With the pop band, the album was already made and they choreographed to it, so we didn't have to adjust.
That's a little easier.
That was a little easier. But
was on the classical side, were you given kind of a set of instructions, maybe a plot, or?
The biggest project like that I did was we were telling the story of Gilgamesh, and it was a play and with ballet interspersed and music throughout. So it was a lot of collaborative back and forth between the playwright and the choreographer and me. And but in that case, we had a story we were starting with, right? So you get to a moment and you say, well, this is the dance where Gilgamesh kills the bull of heaven. So
Right.
that you have a story to tell.
You have a character already established by the drama.
Yeah. I love writing like that because that immediately not only puts so many limits on you, but gives you a seed to work from.
So if let's say you were not working on a commission, you were just working from scratch on your own, do you like to approach composition then from a dramatic standpoint? I want to tell some kind of story. It doesn't have to be a direct story like, somebody opened the door and walked in the room, but like, let's say a dramatic narrative as opposed to what Isabel and Ron were talking about, kind of an improvisatory approach where you draw the pitch material out first and then a form is developed organically after that.
Well, I usually start by improvising. I don't think there's much of any other way to do it. I mean, unless you're Mozart and you can just write the whole thing in your head without thinking about it. but yeah, I absolutely think of composing with a storytelling metaphor, and that's what I teach my composition students as well. Like, you have to have characters, as in thematic ideas.
It's not about, I should mention this when I say characters, it really is not about, and same thing happens in when performing repertoire. Characters aren't necessarily characters as if in a play with a direct dramatic action. It's about musical characters that work well together. There's a logic in sound that proceeds from A to B to C and back. Yeah,
Exactly,
all in
exactly.
the
Yeah,
page there.
yeah. It's metaphoric. It's not necessarily a direct story. Although you can look at sonata form and think of, you've got two themes that are two characters and they have different personalities, and then in the development they interact with each other, and then at the end they've been modified, they've been changed by the whatever they went through together, right?
Right.
That, I think that metaphor works for just about everything.
Yeah, one of the simple things in performance that we always talk about is, we mentioned when we repeat music as a performer, you never want to do it the same way twice. And I love what you brought up there in terms of, let's say, a philosophical approach to writing music is when you have characters interact, the interaction changes them. Just as if when two people meet, we change by exchanging ideas, by exchanging experiences. We're not the same person anymore. In the same way, the music, I love that in sonata form is a great example. It's like, it's such a great dramatic form. You present two ideas, they clash in the middle, they're broken down, they're analyzed, and before they're synthesized again. And when they're put back together, the harmony changes, always. But by definition, the harmony has to change. As a result, character has to change. You cannot play it the same way as you did the first time.
Yeah.
And the audience, even if it's not trained, you will pick up on it. You will hear that, and it will move you emotionally to hear something you've heard at the beginning transform. So not only harmonically, but actually the way we play it. And it.
Yeah, and I love what you mentioned. You can't ever play a piece the same way twice, right? Even if you try to, you can't possibly do the same thing.
We're humans.
Just like you can't. What's the saying? You can't swim in the same river twice. Right? Something like that, right? Yeah. Yes, and just your interaction with the piece changes you, and you're going to do it differently the next time.
Love it.
Yeah,
Franklin, we've ignored you for a little bit. I know you as you mentioned earlier, you write in many different styles and genres. What are some of your approaches when you start composing? I imagine it's also improvisation is an important element, because I know you improvise beautifully. So
it absolutely is, and I think there's an article I read one time that sort of put music and language sort of in the same kind of place, where he was talking about learning how to improvise and put it in sort of terms of like a 2-year-old learning how to speak, or a baby learning how to communicate, and I feel like that improvisation is sort of the way that we sort of talk out loud through our instruments, and finding out what we need to craft permanently in writing sort of starts with just speaking for a little while to see what sounds good. But yeah, I definitely, start out by improvising. I'm not like a professional composer, so I kind of have the ability and the privilege to wait for an idea that really sits. Like a lot of my compositional ideas come to me in the car while I'm driving, and then I'll either forget them or I will write them down as soon as I get home, or record them.
Do you ever have a situation where like, oh my god, I need a piece of paper now, or I will forget that? Do you have?
I will sing ideas into my phone because I can't write while I'm driving.
Matthew and Isabel as well. Same. Yeah.
And every time that I've done that, though, I've gone back to listen to it and rejected almost every single one of them.
You're like, this is an incredible idea.
Sorry.
One of the most interesting sort of processes for generating material was when I was working on a play with my brother. He did a one-man show called an Iliad, which was about, it was like a condensed telling of the story from the poet's perspective. He was the poet and I was the muse. And so he was telling just sort of the story of Hector and Achilles. And the way we did it was he and his director, who's his wife, and the stage manager, who's a close friend of theirs, all sat down and did some wordplay together on each of the characters. And then they came back to me and started, telling me these words. And as they sort of said those words to me, I started thinking about like melodies and stuff, and I'd play something for them, and then they'd give me feedback. And eventually we had a theme crafted for each one of the characters, and everything else was kind of improvised in between, just into soundscapes and things like that. And that was probably some of the fastest and most fun generation of just raw material.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I know. There's no, if we look through history, there's not one recipe. Everybody has different approaches. I love that improvisation is such a big part of it. And actually, I'm kind of, one of the things that I'm sad, and I didn't have in my musical upbringing, is that improvisation is not something which is taught in a typical performance degree. So much of the focus is on mastering the instrument that the musical element of improvisation, because you're not using it to win an orchestra audition, which is kind of the typical stream in conservatories, improvisation is left out. And, I have a great question from David Whitehill in the chat. He says, if Bach were alive today, would he be writing in the Baroque style? Would the organ be his instrument, or would he lean more to electronics or something else? Of course, we don't know for sure. But, it begs the question. I think the element of improvisation that existed as a church organist, and it was a practical element. I mean, if you're performing in service and service goes a different direction, you have to create music on the spot to be able to do it. Also, as an organist, here was a composer who was dealing with multiple voices at the same time, both with feet and with hands, one of the great virtuosos of his day. Of course, he could come up with things. And, he left a body of work probably that we don't, it's not even the entire body that we're aware of. Sadly, a lot of it was lost. And it's some of the most amazing music written at the time. I don't know what Bach would be doing today. I would hope he would be getting performed, which he, it's interesting. There's, one of the greatest composers who was performed it was writing music for the service, generally for church service on the Sunday, that was heard then, and that was it. A la carte music. Please write, I need a cantata for this service that's taking place on Sunday. So you got between Sunday evening and Wednesday night rehearsal to figure it out. And if you consider that, I mean, it's, wow, mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing. But I do regret, I come back to the element of improvisation that all of you brought up. I think one of the key points in music, in the Western musical tradition, is when the composer goes away from being a performing musician to what Franklin said, you have the luxury of not being a professional composer. I'm not a fan of the idea of the professional composer. I'm a fan of the idea of the great musician who we get to get into their mind and hear what's in that mind. And I regret that people like Itzhak Perlman and Yo-Yo Ma and Yefim Bronfman don't compose. The best musicians, the best performing musicians in the world are not composers. And I think that's a loss. And I think our art suffers from the fact, because it really, I would love to hear what, somebody like that would be able to create and to give posterity. But that's where we're at. I will take your note. Since we're talking about old composers, I wanted to go around. Like, what are your influences? If you had to name 3 composers or 3 musicians who influenced your style, who would they be? Let's start with Isabel.
Oh, so fast.
Go for it. On the spot. Boom, boom. First thoughts.
Composer, Ravel, Bjork. Ravel, Bjork, and probably a slew of Indian musicians. What I will say really quick to what you were speaking, though, is I've often thought about that too in Western like in Western music, how it has become this designated field of study, like composition and composers. And oftentimes my friends who are composers have like, really let go of themselves as performers, like whatever it is that they grew up playing, in service of that craft. And I don't think that that is the tradition the world over that I've observed in my dabbling of different traditions. In a lot of traditions, the people who play are still writing the new songs. So that is something that has like shifted in like Eurocentric, like American music. Yep. In that field. And I do think, yeah, we miss a richness for that by like not having the voices of performers more intertwined and like showing. And that's it's an exciting prospect, and I love teaching improvisation. And in that way, I have all these exercises and limitations that I love to like give to myself and share. And even though I don't take that necessarily as a composer, and I probably should, it would be helpful.
Right. God, there's so many things to unpack here. It's really we've opened up a Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Of things. But okay, so coming back to the original question, it was Ravel, Bjork, and a slew of Indian composers.
Yeah. Maybe I'll say like Ravel, Bjork, and like Tumani Diabate, just to get it. Like I'll switch over.
I love it. Matthew, what about you?
Well, in the standard composer realm, it's got to be Chopin. I think not
Chopin, we should mention to the audience at home, turned the world of harmony upside down.
Yeah.
And while basically composing for one instrument.
Right.
Just composing for the piano, he completely changed the way we think about harmony. He extended it. The palette was extended enormously. It's all of a sudden like a billion new colors were discovered.
Yeah. And here at UNCA, we teach primarily jazz to our performance majors. And when they wonder why they need to study the classical repertoire, I say, look at Chopin, and everything that you're playing in jazz is right there in Chopin. He laid it all out for you.
Yeah.
I love that. So that's a big one. Probably my second one would be probably the band Rush, who I listened to.
Okay.
About 15 years, probably about all I ever listened to for a while. Yeah. And then I don't know what would be after that. I would have to think. I don't know who my third one would be. Maybe Paul Simon.
Okay.
Yeah, one of my favorites. Cool. But I want to jump in again, like Isabel did with.
No, it's okay to jump in. We can jump in anytime on any of these topics. That's what it's all about.
Now I lost it. What was I going to jump in about? What was the
about musicians who are also composers?
Oh, yeah,
like
right.
the tradition of playing and composing.
Yeah, that's a great thing about being a percussionist in the classical world, is that we don't have centuries of music like string players and pianists have. So most classical percussionists are, well, maybe not most, but quite a lot of us are composers, and a lot of the very best percussion performers are writing their own music, which is really great. Unfortunately, it doesn't tend to spread that much into the wider world, and we tend to kind of get it stuck within our community. But some of the greatest percussion music around is being written by some of the great players, and it's really amazing.
Yeah,
it's a renaissance of music that unfortunately most other musicians aren't aware of, but there's some amazing stuff out there.
Very cool. Ron, I wanted to, I know you have kind of a spotty internet, so you're jumping in and out, but wanted to get your perspective. Favorite composers, favorite influences, three people.
What somebody asked, I know also that for myself, that the times that I've written, one of my favorite pieces that I've ever written were from something that I saw. And back in 1988, I wrote a piece called Listen, the Earth is Weeping. And basically came out of having watched a documentary about the atrocities that were going on, murdering elephants for ivory. You'd see this little baby elephant next to the mother, just devastated. It was just for this ivory. And it affected me so much that I wrote this piece for orchestra, for chamber orchestra, and epic instruments, tablas, and tambora, and piano and harpsichord, solo oboe, and solo cello. Franklin did a performance with the Symphony of the United Nations at Asheville, and I conducted it. Franklin played solo cello, and it came out as a very strong piece, because it really was an expression
Sorry, Ron, sorry, I'm losing you. If maybe you can come a little, it sounds a little better if you're a little closer to the, let's try that.
But anyways, that came out of an emotional experience of witnessing a documentary about the devastation done years ago, and animals and nature. And that's often writing that tells a story, and that to me is the greatest aspect of all my pieces. Always tell some kind of story, and so that's the way I write it. I can't just write music for music. I have to have some kind of vision and some kind of story to tell. Did you hear that?
Mostly, but you talk about the emotional connection as inspiration, basically. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and something very powerful happening either in your life or something that you inspiring to create a piece of music.
Yeah.
I love it. A few questions from our attendees. So here's one. What are some tips for continuing a chord progression? For example, once you have the melody down, how can you add to the piece while being correct in its progression and theory? What are some creative ways to carry out the song piece? Being correct in progression and theory, there is no such thing anymore. Is that fair to say, panel? You really can't do anything. Now, if it's going to sound good or not, ultimately it's your judgment. So I find, I don't know, I'll go around the panel. What are your opinions? You have a melody, you want to enrich it by adding more harmony. What are some approaches you're thinking of? What are you looking at?
Well, I'll jump in and say that theory is description, not prescription, right?
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Theory always comes after the music. So we study it to know what other composers have done, but it doesn't tell us what we need to do. So if you know your theory and you know what you want the thing to sound like, the theory can help you get there, but it doesn't tell you what you have to do. And ultimately, you got to remember that it's a set of tools that are in the service of your ear.
Right. Oftentimes it's trial and error, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that, Franklin, Isabel?
I think it's good to look at music both like in terms of chords vertically, like chord, but also linearly in terms of like looking at how what each voice is doing.
And the voice leading of each individual line.
Exactly.
Right.
And it helps me to sort of think more about the line of the voices and how they're interacting. And sometimes that helps inspire new harmonies and new tensions to release and things like that. There's a great book that deals with that by Johann Fuchs, F-U-X. And it's like it's like a Renaissance approach to counterpoint. And it sort of deals with intervals and voice leading and dealing with tension and release.
I love that you brought that up. The element of the concept of a chord, like, if you're going to buy a pop song, you play guitar, you're going to have chords and you can play the harmony on the guitar and you can sing the song and it's going to sound good. Same thing with the piano chart. You can express it all just with like play C, play G7, come back to C, it's going to sound good no matter what. But that is the product actually of notation. It's the fact we could notate that we could get to that point. Music prior to this is not constrained on a vertical axis at all. It's about the horizontal axis, and the first approach towards harmony that's kind of established in Renaissance period has nothing to do about vertical structure collectively. It's about, let's say, in moments, vertical structure matters, but overall it was the linear line that mattered as much. And in fact, I don't know much about, again, Indian music directly, but harmony is much more linearly delineated as opposed to vertically. Is that still the case? Sorry, I'm not speaking from a place of expert knowledge, Isabel.
It's often it's very drone centered. So I would say harmony is more consequence than intention usually.
It's static. It's not moving.
Yeah, because it's usually if it's raga based music, they're going to be in what we would, can loosely call a mode that is going to they're going to stay in that collection of notes. And in some like lighter forms of classical or folk music, they may bring in what we would call accidentals.
Right.
To heighten a mood, but it is always, the tension is always in relationship to the drone.
And it comes back to the drone.
Yeah.
So basically you're starting from a place and going away, coming back.
Yes.
And it's the linear line which creates the interest, not the change of harmony.
Yes.
Which is, let's say, typical in Western music. Ron was going to say something. Ron, sorry. Go ahead. May have lost Ron. He looks, yep, Ron is a little frozen. Okay, we'll come back to Ron. Another question. John Condren is asking me, what about conductors that don't compose? Yeah, there's plenty of us. One of my goals for this birthday was to compose a piece. Quarantine is still going on, so I think I have time to do something that I've delved more into arranging rather than composition. Again, I really find having parameters around me make life easier. David's coming back with a question. The effect of a piece doesn't merely depend on the performance of the musicians, but also on the place it is performed at. Interesting. How do you see the relationship between location and sound? So not all our pieces that you guys are presenting are necessarily in a concert hall. They're in different venues. How does that different? He's asking, in how far do you feel the current system of concert halls is still the right one for current classical music or for contemporary music in general? Is the concert hall a place we can still have new music? What do you think?
Not always.
Not always.
Our quartet has had to adjust our program several times based on the venues that we were performing in. And when we do more contemporary music, we tend not to choose conventional venues. For example, I don't think Sirius B would work very well in a coffee shop, for example.
Right.
And I'm trying to think. I remember one time our quartet did a Philip Glass quartet in a bar. We've done that in a concert hall as well, but it tends to do better when the mood is a little bit more, I don't want to say casual. I don't think that's the right word. But there's definitely something that kind of relaxed the atmosphere a little bit for us to play that piece. Of course, I'm talking about performing now and not writing.
I always wonder this, and I bring this up as a way of when we listen to new music, and we actually have a side question before I delve into my tangent. I would like each of you, in case you have a website or YouTube channel where we can hear your music, why don't you put it in the chat, please, in the chat box, so our guests can look you up. That would be lovely to have a chance to hear some of your music, because we're, talking about music, dancing about architecture, that whole thing. But coming back to Franklin's point, I wanted to ask each and one of you, I find one of the great difficulties in presenting new music to audiences in symphony halls is actually kind of psychological in nature, how we approach hearing the music. And I often think it almost might be better that we have concerts that don't have anything on the program listed, that the program is entirely blank and you just listen to piece. Here's piece 1, piece 2, piece 3. And I wonder, where we come in, I'm talking as a guest, I come into a symphony hall, I see a new piece in the program, and it's so easy to fall into the trap of judging. and hearing the first sound that comes out of the orchestra or from the performance and saying, do I like this or do I not like this? And it's very easy to decide not to like something. And oftentimes I find that a piece of music requires multiple listening to really appreciate it. And in fact, the whole basis of popular music is on finding hooks that are able to be repeated like 15 times in a 3 music song. And of course, we end up loving the piece. A lot of music that's composed doesn't work like that, and we have to give it a chance. How do you approach listening to new music, like as a guest, and simply sharing that experience with our audience? I'd love to hear that.
I think, music is interesting. As someone who's like, I'd spent so much time doing contemporary classical music, especially, and really stretching the boundaries of sound and extended techniques and borderlining on noise a lot of the time, or in straight in noise, and a lot of microtonal music. I mean, sound is something that affects us so viscerally as humans, right? We have such big reactions to it, and I think listening to, depending on the scope of how extended the contemporary piece is willing to get, it really like it impacts us, and it moves us in ways that might be different or uncomfortable. And I think one of the things I loved about deep diving into contemporary music is it like it just brought up different kinds of emotions and feelings and like excitements and tensions that like I kind of had to like navigate as I would sink into these pieces to find beauty in chaos, and like learn different types of expression and language and gesture. And I do think, familiarity with any language makes us understand it better. So like what you're saying, multiple listings of pieces. But I think it's maybe like if we don't get that in a live performance, it's just the regularity of hearing more new music and having like slowly building like a repertoire for it and a language for it and an understanding. And that happens over time because, with the standard and the canon of repertoire, like we've all heard it a lot, and we have an expectation, and we have these things that we relate to with it. And somebody who never listens to classical music may not feel that way when they first hear it. I was having this discussion recently with one of my housemates, and they've now heard more classical music and they like it more now because they've heard it more. But like, a year and a half ago was pretty uninterested in it. And so it's interesting. And I think the same thing is true for contemporary music if we give it that chance to just like allow ourselves to expand our concepts of sound and beauty. And
to follow up on that, and to our other panelists' question, is it fair to call anything contemporary music? Because it seems, would it not be fair to say that we have hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of different styles currently taking place as what is quote unquote contemporary music? Like,
yeah,
it's really difficult to lump a group of composers and say, well, this is the style. Like, this is the Atlanta school. There is an Atlanta school, my friends, which is solely based on the fact that, a group of composers appeared in one CD and they called it a school. Good marketing, but it's not exactly that. You listen to their music, it's completely different. Theophanides Higden are not the same composer. There's no connection whatsoever, other than the fact they were recorded by Robert Spano on a really good CD. But like, what are your takes on that? I think it's really easy that I come back to this element of judgment, and Isabel, you touched on this. You kind of have to sink and be okay with being uncomfortable in the moment and not judge and kind of let it go through and say, fascinating.
yeah,
It's like trying a completely new cuisine, like eating crickets or something like that, because it's really far. It can be completely far out. What do you think, Matthew?
But I think, yes, you have to be brave, and you have to be willing to let these things wash
Like a
over you.
cold shower. It's supposed to feel
Yeah.
good, but the first experience is like,
Right. Yeah, I'm completely on board with the John Cage idea that every sound is interesting, and that doesn't mean you're going to put it on at your wedding reception, but you there's a time and place for it, right?
Right.
I would also
Right.
say, it's up to history to say what the style is now. I'm sure that Bach probably didn't know how his music was going to be classified either, because he probably heard
Certainly
lots
didn't
of
call it
other.
Baroque.
Yeah, Yeah,
right?
the word Baroque came later, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's impossible for us from our vantage point now to know what will end up being the music of our time because there's so much that there's just so much. There's so
Right.
much.
Well,
Yeah.
even just talking to the four of you, it's clear from the very beginning, just talking how you approach composition, how you have different approaches, music is going to be different. And four of you are living in Asheville, you know, you're based here, you're based in this musical community, your expression is entirely your own. And, you know, we're really, again, we're not bound by things. Ron, how do you approach listening to a new piece of music when you hear it for the first time in the hall? What's your approach? Oh,
Talking to me. Um, to me, it's either you love it or leave it. And what I tried to say, I don't know. I apologize for this bad, Wi-Fi signal, but I really love fusion. To me, the whole concept of world sounds, the classical sounds, is wonderful. And in my music, I always try to create that element of fusion, of not just sort of contemporary abstract, but weaving in world Indian, African instruments, and so that's what moves me. But it's got to come from your heart. I mean, to me, if music doesn't touch my heart and only my intellect, it doesn't turn me on. That's me personally.
yeah. Yeah, it actually is also I face that a lot when I speak to people about music. I have to give a a pre-concert talk on composers, whether new or old. And you talk about it, and I can talk. Okay, this is really interesting form. This is really interesting harmony, melody, whatever. But it comes back to what you just said. The only reason it works is because it moves us emotionally, and that's very hard to convey in talking about music. We really have to hear it. And yeah, no, I love, you know, we live in an age of globalization. It's only natural that our music will fuse and will have different influences. If I ever do end up writing music, I'm sure it'll draw on the folk traditions that I grew up with, that you know, that raised me musically in my childhood. So it's only natural to have that. Franklin, any parting thoughts before we finish up? We'll remind people that you have a concert this weekend of Beethoven sonatas.
Yes.
But I'm coming back to this issue about new music and listening to it, listening to new composers. Any thoughts?
Well, it's funny. Like it's been about a century now since composers tossed the conventional diatonic system, the major and minor scales, and started, intentionally writing dissonances. So we've been doing this for a long time now and trying all these different things. And I think one of the coolest things that's happening right now is that things are starting to mix back together. It's like Ron's idea of fusion, that there's this big sort of melting pot and everything is just kind of coming together in all these different cool ways. And I think the first time I really noticed it was when it was the Orpheus Orchestra had put together a project where they commissioned 6 different composers to each write a Brandenburg concerto. So they took like the instrumentation from each Brandenburg concerto, and one composer would take that instrumentation and write their own Brandenburg concerto, and they put them and they released them together. And it was just so cool to see all the different ways that they decided to play with those instruments. I had one more thing that I've been sitting on for a little while, and it had to do with listening to other music and influences and stuff like that. And I always think of Beethoven when I think about that, because somewhere towards the end of Beethoven's life, he lost his access to outside influence. In his early music, he sounded a lot like Mozart and a lot like Haydn, and he had his own voice, and he did this incredible work of like putting his voice out there and establishing a new direction for things. But when he lost his hearing, all of a sudden he couldn't hear what anybody else was saying anymore, and that's when his music really went off the rails.
And it's still off the rails.
Yeah, like it got to a point where he could only express inside his imagination, and he didn't really have access to what other people were doing, and it had a really deep impact on what he said.
Yeah,
Became soul music. Became soul music.
it
I
Yes,
did.
couldn't hear it.
it's so
Where was
profound.
it?
Yeah, and well, a lot of it, the majority of Beethoven's late work is intimate, which means it's not necessarily for a public, but for personal expression.
Hmm.
It was very deeply connected to his experience. I love it. Any parting thoughts before we conclude our composition hour here at ASO at Home?
I want to say one thing, if you can hear me,
Yeah,
and that is as a composer, and I think as composers, to try to also really address current things that are going on in our world, and with politically, um, environmentally, socially. There's a lot of problems, and I feel that I have to, if I'm going to write something, I have to make some kind of statement about what is going on in this world. How can we change it, and how can we help people be aware
Hmm.
that we need to be more connected to our heart and more connected to the earth and more connected with the reality that we're all sharing this journey through space on this ship called the earth, and we really need to work together to try to change things because it's not good. We all know that, you know. But I think as a composer, to also do that, address social, spiritual, and subjects that are very important to environment as well.
I love that, Ron. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Isabel, Matthew, any parting thoughts?
I don't want to say anything after that. That was great.
Ron, you're a hard act to follow.
Well,
When you get to be 72, you get some things, yeah, you know, whatever. You know, stay connected, you know, and
I love it.
this has been a pleasure for me because I don't see you guys. You know, there was a
I
time,
know.
but other things. But it's beautiful to see you all and to see the youth and the vitality. I mean, I went to the New England Conservatory of Music when Gunther Schuller was president, and I got to play for.
no,
Oh,
Ah,
we wanted that story.
he'll be back. He'll be back. Well, I just, Isabel, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you if you wanted to
Oh,
add.
that's okay. It's just been, I've loved hearing you all, and it's wonderful to talk with you, and it's inspiring to hear just different ideas and engage with other musicians right now, which we're not, we could just do this more, and it's fun. And yeah, I agree. I think with, what Ron was saying, as artists, we definitely get to like be in and process the times that we live in unique ways and express through that and share through that, and I also really value finding ways of incorporating, especially in my songwriting, more of what happens like in the world that comes through as a musician and an artist to expressing and connecting to others. It's a powerful tool. Yeah.
Well, thank you for spending time with us this evening, to all of you. And again, isabelcastelvi.com, ronclearfield.com, matthewwrichmond.net, and Franklin versus seriesbmusic.com. Is that where we can? Yeah, that was the one. So they're all in the chat box. Please take a look and visit and check out their music. And again, this weekend, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, Franklin has a performance of all the cello, the works for cello and piano by Beethoven. Wonderful undertaking. So make sure to check that out. And thank you for joining us and discussing this. I think talking about composition, it really is, it's something that's rarely addressed in the symphony hall. We listen to great works, but we don't consider the actual creative process that it takes to get there. So I thank all of you for kind of giving a little bit of background on what the process is like, especially today's day and age. And it's funny, we've developed so much technologically, we have so many experiences, yet some of the ways we approach in writing music, you all brought out, they haven't changed. The humanity is there. It's the need to express something, the need to be connected to your own personal soul. And then, you know, your influences, you cannot ignore them. They are part of you and they help you find your voice. So again, thank you for the time. Next week, same time, we have we welcome, it's going to be a program designed for our Asheville Symphony Youth Orchestra, but the grown-ups are welcome. It's going to be a conducting class led by yours truly. So it should be a fun and a silly time. I look forward to seeing you then. And thank you again for joining. It's so wonderful to have so many people come for this fascinating panel. And I look forward to hearing your music. I'll check out all the websites, and I hope you do too. Thank you again, and have a lovely evening. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.